All right, ready to dive deep. Today we're tackling workplace romances and how they can sometimes lead to accusations of sexual harassment.
Oh, yeah, that's a tricky one.
It really is, and we're going to try to untangle how these situations are judged, especially when things get messy.
Sounds juicy.
Oh, it is. We're going to be looking at a 2004 study from the Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes Journal. It's by Pierce, Broberg, McClure, and McGinnis.
A Guinness, like the beer.
Exactly. And one of the things that really jumped out at me from this study was the statistic that between 24 and 31% of HR professionals actually reported dealing with sexual harassment claims that came directly from workplace romances.
Wow. So like a quarter to almost a third. That's a pretty significant chunk.
It is. So let's dig into this, okay?
Yeah.
What were these researchers really trying to figure out?
Well, they were really interested in romances specifically between bosses and their subordinates.
Which, I mean, that makes sense. You've got a power dynamic right there.
Exactly. And they're more common than you might think. So the study was trying to understand how people on the outside looking in, like maybe coworkers or HR, how do they judge those situations, especially when a harassment complaint comes up after the romance has ended?
Okay, so it's not just about the harassment itself, but the whole history of the relationship.
Right, exactly. And to kind of get a handle on all of this, they use this ethical decision-making framework.
Ooh, sounds fancy.
Yeah, it can sound a little academic, but it really boils down to this idea that when people are faced with a situation where there's like an ethical dilemma, they go through these steps, right? First, they got to recognize that it's even a moral issue.
Okay.
Then they make a judgment about it.
Right.
Then they decide if they're going to do anything about it.
Yeah.
And then finally, they actually behave in a certain way based on all of that.
Okay, so like a whole thought process. But how does that apply to like a situation where, somebody is accusing their ex of harassment?
Well, I think it helps us to understand how people on the outside who are observing this, how are they deciding who is responsible?
Ah, okay.
And the researchers were really interested in this idea of moral intensity.
Moral intensity, okay.
Yeah, basically it just means the more severe the consequences of an action seem and the more agreement there is that it's wrong, the higher that moral intensity is.
Oh, that makes sense.
So like certain details about the romance or about the harassment itself can make the whole thing feel more or less morally intense to someone who is looking at it from the outside.
Okay, so like, for example, if you have a boss who's pressuring someone they're dating for sexual favors,
Yeah.
that's probably going to feel a lot more morally intense.
Oh, for sure.
And probably wrong than, just some exes who are having some awkward run-ins by the coffee machine.
Right, exactly. And that feeling of intensity, how intense it feels, can really influence how people decide who to blame.
Interesting. So to test all of this out, they created scenarios, right?
Indeed, yeah.
Little stories about office romances gone wrong.
Yeah, it was all hypothetical.
Okay, so what kind of scenarios, what kind of stories did they cook up?
Well, in the first experiment, they focused on two main things. So one was the type of reporting relationship between this former couple.
So was the guy directly the woman's boss? Or were they kind of on a more even playing field?
Yeah, that's exactly it. They wanted to see if that power dynamic really influenced how people saw the situation.
Okay, makes sense. And the second factor?
The second thing they looked at was the type of romance itself.
Oh, okay. So how do they categorize the romances?
They looked at three different types: companionate, fling, and utilitarian.
Okay, break those down for me. What's a utilitarian romance? That sounds a little, I don't know, a little calculated.
It is. It is. It's basically when one person is using the relationship to get ahead at work.
Ah, okay.
So maybe they're trying to get a promotion or some special treatment.
Yeah.
And the other person is more in it for like the ego boost,
Yeah.
the attention.
So somebody's kind of taking advantage of the situation.
Yeah, exactly. It can get really messy really fast. And it might not even be like a conscious thing on the part of the person who's using the other person.
Right.
But that's just the nature of how power dynamics can work sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. I bet those different types of relationships had a real impact on how people viewed the situation. So what did they find?
You're right, they did. So for example, when the scenario was a direct reporting relationship, the man was actually seen as more responsible for the harassment.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh. That kind of seems counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Wouldn't people be more likely to blame the boss? Like he's the one with the power?
You'd think so, right. But it seems like there might be this underlying assumption that because it's a boss and a subordinate, there's probably more scrutiny on the relationship.
Right.
And so maybe the woman might feel more pressure to just kind of go along with things, even if she's uncomfortable.
Yeah, or maybe worried about, like, her job or something.
Exactly, exactly. It's really complicated when you start to think about all the different pressures people might be feeling in these situations.
Yeah. Makes you wonder what's really going on behind the scenes sometimes.
For sure. Now, here's another interesting thing they found. When the romance was described as utilitarian, the woman was often seen as more responsible for the harassment.
Oh, wow. So if she's seen as using the relationship to, like, get ahead at work, she gets more of the blame.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. Almost like there's this tendency to blame women more when they're perceived as being ambitious or strategic in their relationships, which again kind of raises some uncomfortable questions about how we view women in the workplace.
It's a good reminder that we all have these unconscious biases and that, it's really important to be aware of them and how they might be influencing our judgments.
Absolutely. So remember that ethical framework we were talking about earlier?
Hmm.
Well, the researchers also wanted to see how people's judgments about responsibility actually translated into what they thought the appropriate response should be. Oh,
So
okay.
they asked participants, like, what do you think should happen in response to this harassment complaint? Should we ignore it? Should we offer counseling? Should there be some sort of disciplinary action taken?
And I'm guessing what people thought should happen depended on who they thought was responsible.
Exactly. It was really striking. When people felt like the man was more responsible, they were way more likely to say that he should face some kind of disciplinary action.
Okay.
But if they blamed the woman, a lot of times they would just say, you know what, do nothing.
Wow. So the woman is potentially blamed and nothing happens about the harassment.
Yeah. It's a pretty disturbing pattern when you think about it. And it really makes you wonder, is there a bias against women in these situations? Are we less likely to believe them when they report harassment if they were involved with the person they're accusing?
Especially given everything we're learning now about power dynamics and accountability in the workplace. This is pretty heavy stuff.
It is. It really is.
So that was experiment 1. What about experiment 2? What did they look at there? Well, in experiment 2, they kind of shifted the focus a little bit. They were interested in how people decided if the man's actions were immoral, and they added some more variables into the scenarios.
Oh, like what?
Well, for instance, they looked at whether the romance was extramarital.
Oh, right.
They also looked at whether the company actually had a policy against workplace romances.
Right.
And they also varied the type of harassment that was being reported.
Oh, interesting. So what do you mean by type of harassment?
They looked at 2 main types: hostile environment and quid pro quo.
Okay.
So hostile environment is more about this general feeling of discomfort or unsafety because of unwanted sexual attention. It's kind of like this overall vibe.
Yeah.
Whereas quid pro quo is when someone who's in a position of power uses that power to explicitly demand sexual favors in exchange for something job-related.
So like a promotion or something.
Exactly. So hostile environment can be a little bit more subtle. Quid pro quo is just like a blatant abuse of power.
Yeah. And I imagine that those differences would probably affect how people judge the situation, right?
Oh, absolutely. And you know what they found? They found that when the romance was extramarital, or if the company had a policy against workplace dating, people saw the man's actions as way more immoral.
Well, yeah, that makes sense, right? It's like it adds another layer of wrongness to the whole thing.
Right.
What about the type of harassment? Did that matter?
It did. As you might expect, quid pro quo harassment was seen as way more immoral than hostile environment harassment. I mean, it just is, right? It's just such a clear violation. And here's where it gets really fascinating. The more immoral the situation felt to people, the more likely they were to both blame the man and recommend that he face consequences.
So it's not just about what happened, but like we said before, the whole context of the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Who has the power? Company policies? Are they cheating? All of that is influencing people's judgments.
It all comes into play. It really highlights how our judgments in these situations are not as simple as we might think. They're shaped by all these different factors, and that has big implications for how we deal with these issues in the workplace.
Yeah, this is definitely giving me a lot to think about. So what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Yeah, it feels like the big takeaway here is that context matters so much. It's not just about the harassment itself, but all these other things that are shaping how people see it.
Right. That's what makes it so complicated. And that's why it's so important for companies to be really clear about their policies. About workplace romances and harassment, like no gray areas. Everyone needs to be on the same page about what's okay and what's not okay.
Yeah, absolutely. But what happens when things do go wrong? What can companies do to make sure that these situations are handled fairly?
Well, I think it really comes down to creating a culture where people feel safe to speak up.
So, like, how do you do that? Well, for one, having good training for employees and managers on how to recognize harassment and what to do about it. And then also having clear procedures for reporting these incidents.
Uh-huh.
And then making sure that those investigations are impartial. It's about taking these complaints seriously no matter what.
No matter what the history is between the people involved.
Exactly. And I think it's also about each of us really challenging our own biases, because this study shows how easy it is to fall into these patterns of blaming the victim, especially if the situation just feels a little iffy.
Yeah.
We have to be really mindful of those tendencies and actively work to overcome them.
That's a great point. This has been such an eye-opening conversation. Before we wrap up, any final thoughts for our listeners as they're out there navigating all the complexities of work and relationships and everything?
I think the study really focused on perceptions of responsibility and morality.
Right.
But what it also brings to light, I think, is just how crucial communication is.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Whether you're thinking about starting a workplace romance or you're dealing with the fallout of one that has gone sour, just being really open and honest in your communication is so important.
So, like, talk to your partner. Talk to HR.
Yeah, talk to a trusted friend or a mentor. Just don't let things fester in silence.
That is such good advice. I think the more we can have open conversations about this stuff, the better chance we have of creating workplaces that are actually safe and respectful for everyone.
I think so too. I think so too.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for joining us.